Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to see such a diverse and big crowd. On behalf of the Business Ethics and Society program, welcome to this installment of the Berges Lecture Series. My name is John Sikorsky. I'm a faculty member in the Business Ethics and Society program in the Mendoza College of Business, BESP. BESP is a community that fosters interdisciplinary collaboration among faculty and students, promoting a holistic approach to business education. BESP explores the moral purpose of business and its role in creating a just, humane, and sustainable world. We also feature an exciting, and I would say growing, minor called Business and the Common Good. In the Business and the Common Good minor and beyond, BESP encourages students to ask not only how businesses operate, but also what business people should do and why. What is the value of a career in business, and how might the study of ethics, with a special emphasis as well on Catholic social thought, deepen our understanding of our undergraduate work, students' potential careers in business, and our world itself, and the roles we can play in it. One of BESP's activities is sponsoring lectures featuring distinguished speakers. Today's Berges lecture features Professor Russ Hittinger. I'd like to thank Dean Martin Kremers, as well as all the faculty and staff who have helped organize today's event. We extend also a special word of thanks to the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, including Justin Petrisek and Professor Jennifer Newsom-Martin for their generous help with the lecture. Finally, please note, for the students here, we are giving away some copies of Professor Hittinger's new book on the dignity of society. If you'd like a free copy, we will give them out first come, first serve, and you can do so by putting your name on the sign-up sheet. Alas, they're getting here tomorrow. So if you want a free book, students, on your way out, we'll have a sheet for you to put your name on, and we will go first come, first serve on that list.
You did purchase these things, right?
Huh. This is business ethics, so I hope so. All right, we are here today for the Berges Lecture sponsored by the John A. Berges Endowment, which is an annual lecture series hosted by the Mendoza College of Business. The series features senior leaders speaking about their experiences with the ethical dimensions of business. I would like to say a bit about John Berges, who went by Jack and died in 2014 at the age of 94. Jack Berges attended MIT, where he was in ROTC, played on the golf team, and graduated in 1940 as a mechanical engineer. He worked as an engineer before joining the U.S. Army in 1942 and was awarded an honorary member of the British Empire for his assistance to the British Army while overseas. After leaving the military, Berges subsequently began a 35-year career in management with the General Electric Company. Jack Berges was devoted to service throughout his life and served on numerous school boards and parish committees. He continued in retirement as a board member at Holy Cross College. A lifelong proponent of ethics in business, his children endowed the John A. Berges Business Ethics Lecture Series at the University of Notre Dame in his honor. It is our great privilege to host this latest installment of the Berges Lecture Series in honor of Jack Berges. Professor Mary Hirschfeld will soon introduce our speaker, the eminent scholar of Catholic social thought, Professor Russ Hittinger. Professor Hirschfeld is a faculty member and former director of the Business Ethics and Society program, a faculty member in our theology department here at Notre Dame. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Hirschfeld.
I can't project the way John did. All right. It's my profound pleasure to introduce to you Professor Russ Hittinger, who's also a good friend. So when I stepped up to the plate to introduce him, the one daunting task in introducing Russ is that to properly introduce him with all of the honors and accolades and accomplishments he's amassed over his long and distinguished career would take literally all night. So I'm just going to start with what happened after he retired. He became professor emeritus at University of Tulsa in 2019, and he let himself stay retired for about 5 minutes. Since then, among other things, he's been a fellow at Lumen Christi, a visiting scholar at Chicago, working with the Committee on Social Thought, a visitor at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, where he also serves as the president of the College of Fellows. He's received prestigious awards like the Aquinas Medal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's currently the director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. My favorite highlight of his long curricula vita is that he's on not just one, but two Pontifical Academies, one on St. Thomas Aquinas and the other on the social sciences. Okay, all these endless accolades and accomplishments are built on Hittinger's intellectual project. He's considered by many, and I don't know who would disagree with this, as the world's leading expert on Catholic social thought. He has achieved that status or prominence by combining a truly breathtaking range of just erudition of the historical documents, the historical context. I mean, you just push a button and you will get just this endless stream of facts and incidents, and all this stuff comes at you. So incredible historical depth to his thinking, but he combines that with his philosophical training, with the thought of especially St. Thomas Aquinas, but reflected through St. Augustine. And out of that intensely rich soil, he offers us a clear and powerful and crystal clear and powerful articulation of the Catholic understanding of the human person and especially of society, which is centered on seeing that the dignity of the human person is intimately related with the dignity of society, which is the name of the book that will be coming tomorrow. In that book, in the very first essay, is his landmark article, The Coherence of the Four Basic Principles of Catholic Social Doctrine. It has a vision of society and the human person that is desperately needed in a world of fraying institutions and political chaos. So in this world, Hittinger's work is essential, and I'm very proud to introduce him as our speaker tonight.
Thank you. That's it? You on?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Wow. Thank you, Mary. And we thank, of course, the Business Ethics and Society program. And after the introduction, the Berges family. Sounds good? And my editor and collaborator, Professor Scott Ronninger here, who is the one that landed on the cover, well, picked the cover of my book. It would take a while to explain what's on that cover, but perhaps we can do it later. So the title, Catholic Social Teaching, Taking Stock. But I was thinking this afternoon, I should have a different subtitle, more along the lines of Unsolicited Criticism and Advice. Perhaps some of you have read the famous Catholic novel by George Bernardo's The Diary of a Country Priest. In fact, I think I had to read it as a sophomore at Notre Dame 55 years ago. I don't know if they still teach it, but there's a fantastic conversation between the younger cure and the older priest in this quasi-rural parish. And the older priest says, that famous encyclical of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, you can read it without turning a hair, like any instruction for keeping Lent. But when it was published, sonny boy, it was like an earthquake. And by the way, it was kind of an earthquake. The New York Times printed it in its entirety. I think only Pacem in Terris is the next one, only twice. John Paul II in Centesium Usanus said, Rerum Novarum gave papacy and Catholic social teaching citizenship status, by which I think he meant people noticed that the Catholic tradition was finally connected with social facts on the ground. It was entering a conversation that belonged to everyone. And indeed, Rerum Novarum was elegantly simple and concise. It's the first encyclical everyone should read and go back to because of its concision and brilliance. Compared to the mammoth encyclicals of our time, you could read Rerum Novarum in 35 minutes. By the way, I read it for the first time here at the old sod as a sophomore. Now, here are the parts of it. Man is made unto the image and likeness of God, because the human being is an agent, a rational agent, who is provident not only for himself, but for others. So built into the notion of the imago is not only our substantial unity, dignity as human beings, but our social relationships, being provident for others. That's the opening. By the way, it's paraphrased in Rerum Novarum, but if you want to find the quote, it's the first quote in the Secunda Bars of the Summa on Human Action from St. John Damascene. And now he moves on and gives in only a few pages an argument for why work is indeed a human action, and its dignity does not simply consist in the fact that the human worker is clever enough to move around material relationships. It's more than material relationships. It's foresight. It's really the first emphatic moment of Rerum Novarum. And therefore, to acquire property as one's own is necessary for human dignity. Because property is not just acquiring, but it's giving. He finishes that philosophical reflection in 3 or 4 pages. Bam. Then the next section is on what it means to be provident for one's family. That is the first social bond, that the worker is not just working for money and shouldn't be just working on a off and on daily stand in the line to see if you have a job that day. But he must be provident for a family which doesn't come and go on a daily basis. And therefore, it's right that the worker be compensated enough to at least fulfill first social obligation. Back then, anyway, for most people, the first social obligation is wife and children. Now, he moves on to the third part. This includes a moral right that should be recognized by law. By the way, he has very little to say about the state in Rerum Novarum. Make a note of that. The state is not even really discussed until toward the end. The worker has a right to form associations other than marriage, church, and state. And it is the role of political authority to protect what used to be called arbitrary social bodies, which means you enter them by a kind of choice. Not to say people don't get married by a choice, but this is stuff like, insurance associations, and today motorcycle clubs. And final section, this includes the right of collective bargaining. Bam, the encyclical is over. The Rerum Novarum is over before Laudato Si hardly begins. Now, my first point that I want to make in taking stock, in the centuries of the millennium before Leo, Catholic social thinking is not highly organized. But it tended to be gathered under the rubric of Doctrina Civilis, not Socialis, but Civilis. Now, of course, the church for centuries had plenty to say about social institutions. The church and its hierarchy, religious orders, their properties and immunities, marriage, and nota bene, dueling. Dueling is one of the most persistent issues brought up for a millennium, because before it was called dueling around the 15th, 16th century, it was basically the feudal right of aristocrats to use armed force, including against each other. Tithing, trade, go on and on and on. And some of these teachings over the centuries were put into letters that were passed around among a certain set of bishops in a particular ecclesiastical region or country. And that's where we get the word encyclical from, something that's passed around, circulated. But until John the 23rd, they always list the people right at the beginning. And we don't list the people as often. All men of goodwill, we say today. But in the old days, there was a limit to how it could be circulated and who was affected by it. But it was not formally denominated as Doctrina Socialis. In fact, that does not happen until 1931 under Pius XI, who said he inherited a Doctrina Socialis. He was Leo's student, by the way. No, before that it was Doctrina Civilis. And even Leo XIII, who was definitely thinking socially and not just politically, refused to change the phrase. It was changed in 1931. So why? I just want to give you a brief reflection on why this notion of civil doctrine lasted for so long and was not easily displaced. Well, until the late 18th century, more or less, social life was relatively uncontested. Compared to our culture wars, relatively uncontested. I mean, for example, with the exception of Gnostic groups in the Middle Ages, thinking of Albigensians, maybe, no one contested the fundamental social nature of marriage. One man, one woman, free of impediments, who make religiously recognizable vows, entitled to raise a family. Not even the Reformation challenged that. And other aspects of social life. You enter the church by baptism. You enter a trade through a society based upon professionals in that trade. These things go on and on and on. Now, what was contested? And it was still being contested at the time of Leo. Is that the two great societies were both called civil. That is, church and state. They were both called civil because they had courts and they issued decrees. They had legislation And so it wasn't society directly that was contested for many centuries. It was jurisdiction over society. So, for example, in the Reformation, Lutherans and Catholics didn't fight over what marriage is. But boy, they fought over who had jurisdiction in cases concerning marriage. Some of them fought over whether it's a sacrament. And so if you put yourself back into an older mentality, even Leo was born, by the way, in 1810. When he was a boy, Napoleon was still, well, in Italy, actually, hauling off all sorts of treasures. So wherever there is a jurisdictional claim over a social matter, whether it's dueling, does it belong to the aristocrats or does it belong to the king? Marriage, does it belong to the king or does it belong to the church? Land, educational institutions. Boy, and the big one, 16th century exploration and colonization. Who do they belong to? And who has jurisdiction over the naturales in the New World? This is why Leo was reluctant to just dump the term Doctrina Civilis. Because it's not a lower thing, it's a higher thing. A higher thing in the sense that both church and state have some, how to put it, jurisdictional claim to social issues. By the way, by the time Leo is elected, 1878, one big fact had changed. A really important fact. The Pope no longer had the Papal States, which were then called the Patrimonium Petri, because Pepin gave that to the papacy, not to the papacy, but to St. Peter. So the Patrimony of Peter, but they were ruled under a government that was half ecclesiastical and half civil. Right? Leo had 2 law degrees. You had to. Canon law and civil law for governing the states, or the patrimony. So Leo was free, or freer than his predecessors, to dump civilis, the adjective, if he wanted to. But he didn't want to because he wanted them back. And eventually, he figures out he's not going to get them back. And there are some advantages not to having them at all. Now, he's also dealing with the greatest century of state-making regimes in history. Virtually every country in Europe develops what we call states. Courts, police, taxes, geographical boundaries, geographically bounded. And so the papacy could not do that. It had to be, in a way, unbound, spiritually. So he could have dumped civilis. And by the way, the overlapping jurisdiction thing had been much softened by the time of Leo. This was also the century not only of state-making regimes, probably the greatest was Germany. But there were profound social problems. By the way, 19th century is relatively free of war. After the Napoleonic Wars, there's a Franco-Prussian War that lasts for about 5 weeks and it's over. But they were not free of social problems. because there was massive movement of rural population into cities by mid-19th century. In fact, 70% of the entire population of what would become Germany moved from rural areas to cities. So you have the urban dispossessed. This is Karl Marx, all that is solid melts into the air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is compelled to face with his sober senses the real conditions of his life. Communist Manifesto. Almost everyone could agree by the time Leo is Archbishop of Perugia in the 1840s, almost everyone could agree there's huge social. This is also the era of mandatory education. There are scholars who suggest the thesis that the most important event of the 19th century is mandatory education. It changes everything. Children now belong in a way to the state. Military drafts and so forth. So Leo, as Archbishop, later on becomes Cardinal of Perugia, is well aware of these things. By the way, he did a tour of duty in Belgium to see what industrialization and this kind of stuff was happening in Belgium. He founded the first Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas in Perugia. It's called the Perusian Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And he had he developed a very good background. When he became Pope in 1878, he brought it to Rome and it is now the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas. And part of the focus of that Perusian Academy was to use Aristotle and Aquinas, especially, for analyzing social issues. Everything from how banks ought to work to transportation, to you name it. And they're using Aristotelian categories. So here's Leo now with his old academy in the Vatican. He's a prisoner in the Vatican. He doesn't have a lot to do. He never left the Vatican after that moment. Italy, there was only one country he hated, was Italy, because they took it all away. And he deliberately orchestrated his funeral over to St. Mary Major, so they'd have to take his casket across Rome. The Italians. So here are the principles, the first set of principles that are developed. By the way, he worked out of the a little villa in the Vatican Gardens, which is still there and is still the home of the Pontifical Academies. People would report that in the morning they couldn't find Leo in the Apostolic Palace and they're getting disturbed. They would go out to the villa and he and 10 other philosophers would be sound asleep. They worked until midnight, writing stuff. And they had something more, the telegraph. So they could write encyclicals and would be in the paper in London 24 hours later. That was the dynamism, especially of Rerum Novarum. Leo was shrewd on this. So here's the first way to start the principles. Thomas Aquinas, Prima Secundae, question 26, article 8. We should measure the love of different persons according to the different kinds of union, so that a man is more loved in matters touching that particular union, in respect of which he is loved. And again, comparing love to love, we should compare one union with another. So, 4 questions are kind of tucked into this passage from Aquinas. Who belongs to whom? Let's start simply. Who belongs to whom? I remember when I was in high school, that's the only question people asked. Back when people used to date, right? Who belongs to whom? Second, what is the bond? What is it that characterizes their common action? What ends are they trying to achieve through this bond? And then we can start making other kinds of questions like anthropologists. What do the members kind of owe to one another? But no, I find no evidence that the great century of the invention of social sciences is the 19th century. I find no good evidence that Leo read any of them. Sometimes he refers to Marx or Auguste Comte, but I don't see any, how to put it, interpretation of them or anything else. They're doing this through Aristotle. I mean, not, and through medieval things and Baroque era Thomism. So the adjective, whether we take civilis or socialis, is modifying a bond. It's an adjective that needs the noun, and we want to know what that noun is. And the bond, we can call this the formal cause. The end is the final cause. Question is how, what they're trying to achieve, how they're forming a common life to achieve it. It could be a crew team wanting to win the race, but how do they do it together? A polity that desires peace, suppression of crime, a common life that's safe beyond your first cousins. That's what they're trying to achieve. How are they going to do it? It's called a constitution. It's the bond. It is the formal clause. So, and here they have to make a decision. What does social, we know what political modifies, because there it's the order of peace and justice for a city or even something larger than a city. It has a constitution, its form, and its end or ends. What are we to do with intersubjectivity? Parentheses, you must read Carl Wojtyła's essay on person and community. I believe it's first published 1969, before the papacy. It's included in the New Catholic U collection of Wojtyła's writings. It's the best reflection on the Leonine question I've ever read. It's phenomenological, but not gobbledygooky at all. You can move right through it. So the problem with intersubjectivity, Wojtyła was really good on this. It doesn't necessarily cross the threshold into sociability or a social bond. So we can think of a piazza with 1,000 or 5,000 people in it. It's loaded with intersubjectivity. I know that you know that I know, et cetera, et cetera. Just bristling with it. Oh, go to the opera, same kind of thing. But it is not yet a social subject. There is not a bond. Sometimes there can even become an end, like, let's get the hell out of here. But there's not the form. If you've ever been to Rome, especially on New Year's Eve, you'll know that there's not a form. And so, the next step of this argument, pretty much all of this argument is laid in place by the Leonine era, is there are three necessary societies. There's more than three societies, but there's three necessary societies. Matrimony, hyphen family, polity, and church. This is repeated by Leo's student Pius XI. This is a really important teaching. By the way, there's 100 other societies, but these are called necessary, and the word necessary means two things. First, in the ordinary sort of way we understand the word necessary, neediness. We need something. And in the case of man and woman need one another. Maybe not now, but they did then. They need one another not only to procreate, but to raise the family. There's neediness. And there's need for justice. And that's why polity is the grounds for polity. As I say, something beyond first cousins, because we're not going to survive if we can't figure out how to have a justice beyond the cousin. If you can't do justice except to the cousin, then come and live where I live outside of Newark, New Jersey. It's Sopranos land. Okay. And then church, which has the deepest connection to necessity, which is forgiveness of sin. Stop and think about it. That's needy. You can't give it to yourself. So the three necessary societies are rooted in neediness and that kind of contingency. But the word necessary means something else, which is excellence. Because if you kind of get it right, that is marriage, family, polity, and church, all kinds of human flourishing can begin to happen. It would be extremely difficult to achieve without it. Okay. So this is the core. I mean, it's taken me 15 or 20 minutes, but that's the core of the Leonine social doctrine, even though he didn't call it social yet. But I'll tell you, he was doing social thinking at this point. And just to summarize, just read Rerum Novarum. The state is only introduced at the end, after he establishes what these social principles are. Okay. Oh, I was thinking of a J.D. Vance line on this. This is Secunda 28.8. Therefore, the friendship of kindred is more stable, while other friendships may be stronger in respect of that which is proper to each of them. By the way, that's not an argument, that's not J.D. Vance's argument. So in other words, you measure a social union, or you assess a social union, not necessarily by its vehemence. So what's proper to polity is justice beyond the immediate neighborhood, which is greater than domestic order. It's more of an accomplishment in a way. Yeah, so now, this was momentous for Catholic thinking. We would call it moral, because all of this would have been put under morals. Because beginning to think about societies and bonds and social ends extricated the church from the older jurisdictional battle. Integralists might not like to hear this, but it was a liberation, because by the late 19th century, the church would have lost that battle every time, virtually every time. But when we moved over to something ontologically, how to put it, more varied and richer in many respects, which are the various social orders, the church could make its evaluation of these things, both sociologically and morally in all sorts of ways, without immediately entering something like an investiture controversy or a jurisdictional battle. Now, I have one other reason why it took a long time to use the adjective social. Leo should have done it, but he didn't, and he had his own reasons. And I think I'm right on this, although I'm not 100% sure. Walter Rauschenbusch. Anyone know who Walter Rauschenbusch is? He was also in my first theology class at Notre Dame 55 years ago when we read Leo. We read Rauschenbusch as well. Well, Rauschenbusch published a book that was a runaway bestseller for actually a generation called The Social Gospel. He was from Rochester, New York, a Protestant pastor, I think a German Baptist. And his father taught at Rochester Theological Seminary. This book made a distinction between the individualistic gospel, forgiveness of sins and attainment of heaven, and the social gospel, which was Christ's pure message, which was rebuilding society. I'm almost sure that's a main reason that Leo did not make the move to the adjective sociologist. But this was a great liberation for the church and allowing herself to think socially with a much more varied ontology than what the jurists are going to allow in the jurisdictional dispute. But there was evidence of problems from the beginning. And I will summarize those problems as, with one word, giganticism. If you just stop and think for a moment, but of course there's going to be a problem with giganticism. Because a juridical, jurisdictional problem can always be narrowed. Social life cannot. And it takes on so many different forms besides its essential forms. It's a problem of scale and complexity. Now, I think Leo, by and large, had it under control in his own thinking and writing, but he didn't pull the plug on Chavillus. It's later, and it's Pius XI, when the whole world was melting down. This the Great Depression. I think all but 3 Catholic countries had become or were becoming fascist. I mean, it was right after World War I. Think of the phrase we hear today, building a better world. And the scale and complexity of starting to think in that way is basically to start thinking like the United Nations or Davos. That is, you have to achieve a level of generalization in your analysis that's not going to be very helpful if you go on the ground and look. So my evidence for this problem is twofold. 2 popes stopped writing social encyclicals. And they turned out maybe the 2 smartest popes of the 20th century. That's Pius XII and Paul VI. So Pius XII, Monsignor Pacelli, ordained a priest under Leo, the most experienced and well-educated curialist during those years from World War I into World War II and after. He issued 1 social encyclical 2 months after the invasion, or almost 2 months after the invasion of Poland, Summi Pontificatus, and never wrote another one. Why? Giganticism. Because by the time he could reemerge and actually write stuff and have them published, he gave 2 radio addresses during World War II. No encyclical. Mystici Corpus, yes, that was not either social or political. It's because if you had been a 60-year-old man and World War II is over and everything you've seen up to that point, he judged it was too damn complicated. Too complicated. Remember what we have. We have the largest period of decolonization in human history, beginning in 1945. From Mediterranean region all the way to Asia. We have countries that are changing almost every day. And I say this because I used to collect stamps. I had to change my stamp book every year. Because one country comes into existence, and by the way, 2 years later, it's not in existence at all. Very complicated. And we have beginning of Cold War. Well, it was actually kind of hot into the early 1950s. And so Pacelli said no. And for the rest of his pontificate, which lasted pretty long until 1958, he gave short little talks. And by the way, there's brilliant collections of his short talks, which are very insightful. I mean, everything from medical ethics to also banking and so on. But he didn't want to cover everything in front of him. And for that, he should have at least have been made a blessed. Very, very prudent in that regard. The second one was the second smartest guy, Paul VI, right? Maybe the most experienced curialist of the 20th century, born in 1897. Leo was still Pope. And of course, he inherited the papacy after the death of John the 23rd in 1963. But he wrote Populor Progressio. On the theme of development. And I remember this well, because I'm just old enough. When the so-called new mass was coming into being, and there was the kiss of peace, people would turn to one another and say, "May this development be with you." The whole thing was on development, and it was not well received. And it was not well received for an interesting reason. Liberation theology. And the liberation theologians in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly in South America, claimed that this was a trick. Because development means that the northern world, part of the globe, is going to use all of its resources to take us over. From banks to loans to whatever they're going to do. By the way, they were not entirely wrong on this, I think. And so his favorite audience or target for the encyclical doesn't like it. A lot of other people didn't like it either. He never wrote another one. He did write a year later, Humanae Vitae. That was not well received either, but it was on a different subject. So here we have 2 popes in my lifetime who stopped. And by the way, this is what Paul VI said about stopping. It's actually on record. He wrote a private letter to what was then called Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace, because it was the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. And he said, "I'm not going to write one." And he gave this as a reason. I'm quoting, "In the face of such widely varying situations, it is difficult for us to utter a unified message and to put forward a solution that has universal validity. Such is not our ambition, nor is it our mission. It's up to Christian communities to analyze with objectivity the situation which is proper to their own country and to shed on it the light of the gospel's unutterable words. Unalterable words. So, what was concluded by the way, the letter is much longer than the quote I read. Then does that mean that the Catholic social tradition, social thought tradition, social doctrine tradition, which is formally not even 60 years old, since 1931 in Pius XI, who does it belong to? And who is situated to draw, understand complex relationships at all these different social levels? I should just give a lecture on poor Pius VI on this. But anyway, he never wrote. And I think he died disappointed in the way his thought was being received. Now, there were warning signs at this time. In fact, the warning signs go back to the late 1950s. I don't know how many of you have read Calvez and Perrin, who wrote a book on Catholic social teaching. It was published in English 1958 or something like this. So when I was younger, everyone had it. Like if you had gone through the theology at Notre Dame, every professor's office has on the bookshelf Calvez and Perrin. And they warned, so it's published the last year of Pius XII's life. And they go through a number of different topics. By the way, it's very well written. And this was their warning. Without a precisely articulated objective norm, stop. I don't think they just meant moral norm. I think they're the norm for social analysis. Okay. Continue. Catholic social teaching is a mere bundle of social aspirations analogous to so many social systems, which may be well-intentioned, but which lack precision and strength. And I think they were right. It took people a long time to figure that out. That is, the adjective social, which was so important to this turnaround in the churches, that part of her moral philosophy and theology, the adjective had lost its referent. Social modifying what? Now, there's a long story to tell in between, but I'm going to go right for John Paul II. And in Ecclesia in America, that was the Synod of Bishops, and then the Pope gives an apostolic exhortation summarizing a 2-year-long discussion. He, in his said it would be very useful to have a compendium or a proof synthesis of Catholic social doctrine, including a catechism, which would show the connection between it and the new evangelization. So this is what he wanted, but he says more than that. He didn't want something this thick or that thick. He wanted a penny catechism, something in which the basic principles are articulated without pretending as though you're in the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. That's what he is asking for, because he noticed at this 2-year conference of the Americas that people weren't agreeing on very much philosophically. theoretically. So, he did not want a compendium of applications. He wanted a compendium of principles. And to my knowledge, only one appeared. And it was done by Archbishop and Cardinal Hoffner in Cologne. And it's called Ordo Socialis. It's still in print and you can get it free online. English translation, Ordo Socialis, in which Hoffner, recognizing similar stuff in Germany, for heaven's sakes, in Germans were the best of his social thinkers once upon a time. It's not that big. In fact, you can read it in one sitting, but it goes through the principles. It is not teasing out every application of them and so forth. And so, John Paul II got older, but he said right there in Ecclesia in America, he wants one of these. And he gave the task to Justice and Peace, a council that no longer exists. They worked on it, and it becomes our compendium. By the time it's published, John Paul was too old to do anything about it, but was definitely not a penny catechism. It's like this. It's not well organized. There's contradictions in it. By the way, contradictions are not bad because it helps people to think, but it's not what John Paul II wanted. It is that. By the way, there's more in the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine on partial water treaties in Kyoto than there is on justice. They didn't deliver what they had to deliver on this. How about this line? A large part of the church's social teaching is solicited and determined by important social questions to which social justice is the proper answer. Okay. So I recommend in this genre of literature to read Cardinal Hoffner, Ordo Socialis. It's the closest to what JP2 actually wanted. And then we get my last remark about giganticism with Pellitud. Subtitle, Social Friendship. Well, solidarity understood in its most profound meaning is a way of making history. The word family is used 35 times, something like this. In only 8 places does it refer to a real family, which means in 27 cases it doesn't refer to any kind of society at all. Frequently, references to society in its entirety. So it tries to solve some of these problems by getting even more gigantic. How about this? Charity unites, my colleague Scott Rotzinger always says this, unites 2 dimensions, the abstract and the institutional, since it calls for an effective process of historical change that embraces everything. Now, in fact, marriage family is called a local society. But of course, it's not a local society, it's a particular society. Well, the mafia is a local society as well. So it's the effort, by the way, I'm not just picking on Francis. I go back to the compendium, which is the one he relies on too much, I think, in some of this. that the great advantage of getting out of Doctrina Civilis as the main model, moving to Doctrina Socialis, was opening up the horizon of intelligent Catholic inquiry into a much more complicated subject than juridical relations between church and state. In fact, a subject that really does need to be investigated with a lot more care, let's say post-1850. That was the advantage. The disadvantage is that it's too big. I mean, you have to restrain yourself. That adjective needs a noun, or it needs more than one thing. And if you're going to do any kind of social thinking that's valuable, and it's not just a knockoff of Davos language. And my final comment is, when Aristotle was warming up to write the Politics, he sent the students in his lyceum to go all over the Greek-speaking world and collect constitutions. No one knows how many they brought back, but more than 100. Because Aristotle's saying, we're going to use this word, but we need examples. Let's see what people have actually written down and tried to do. And by the way, it's one of the necessary societies. Because it's, of course, the form for political organization. The Catholic social code really needs to be verified. I'm not saying sternly question, but verify what we mean when we use these terms. Because you know, the adjective social, what is the noun that most modifies today? iPhone? Media. Okay. You've got to verify how words are being used and how human beings actually act. So I think the Catholic social tradition has been tried and tested for a century, and we should keep doing it. But I don't think you should read it on your knees. Find a decent chair or a desk. Read it with your mind. This is not the Nicene Creed. It's something very, very complicated, and well, as I said, unsolicited advice on my part. Thank you.
Well, thank you, friends. We've solicited, we've set aside till 5:15 for any time for Q&A if someone would like to ask a question. Maybe we'll pass the microphone around just so everybody can hear. And as is our tradition, we do try to give priority to students, especially undergraduates. So if someone wants to be bold as a student to ask, we'll start there, but then open it to anybody. I see a hand up somewhere. Oh, Eleanor, all right. You can use the mic.
Thank you for coming in today. So you mentioned that matrimony, polity, and the church are necessary societies. I was wondering if you think like corporations or businesses are necessary societies.
The importance of part 4 of Vera Navarro. Because finally, Leo moves to kinds of human association that are not necessary societies, but are very important. And so, as I said, they used to call them arbitrary societies, which is, it's not going to work today, that word. But it means that they're freely chosen. Now, the The question, of course, for corporations, or the question for students studying here is this a real society with a common end and a shared form? Is it? And I think you should go case by case. Case by case would be very helpful to figure this out. So for years I lived in Oklahoma, and I had to do a 501c3 for a not-for-profit tax-exempt organization. And it was fascinating to read the questions that were asked. And the first one is not-for-profit. Second is it religious? And if you said yes, the next question was, you've got to have something more than a post office box. This is Oklahoma, man. There's 1,000 religions in Oklahoma. And so post office box suggests to the state of Oklahoma that you're not a parish or a church. Or at least it has to be verified. You need a real address to get a religious exemption from the taxes. By the way, there's all kinds of, and then the next question they ask is, how are you organized? Like, do you have a president? Do you have a board? How long? These are all common sense interrogations of social reality. Oh, so my answer is that's what you should be doing. At some point, you've got to verify. And if something is amiss, then you know what you have to correct or what you should urge or recommend. In Leo's day, there really wasn't anonymous business going on. Not much. It was quite public and out in the open, and it was everything from shopkeepers to international trade. Boom. That doesn't mean people didn't cheat. But the social end and form would have been much more easy to verify back then. If I say anything more, then I will reveal my complete ignorance of how to go about this. That would be my first piece of advice. By the way, have them self-report. It's not a bad idea. We're not going to tell you what you want to be. You tell us what you are.
Pass it down to Jordan.
Thank you very much. You did not mention human rights at all, and I'm surprised because, we have Benjamin Terrace, 1963, we have John the 23rd, who was already in Paris as Roncalli, who knew about that. And so what is the importance, how do you see the relationship between human rights and Catholic social doctrine?
Well, part of it is rooted in anthropology. So that is the dignity of the human person.
Well, dignity is not the same thing as human rights. They are related
I'm talking
to
about
each other,
background. I'm
but
talking
they are
about
not the
ground.
same.
I'm not talking about lesser rights. I'm talking about what they might be grounded in. But the other part of it is grounded in social orders. And that's why the last part of Rerum Novarum, well, actually half of the encyclical of Rerum Novarum, is trying to understand why societies have rights. To exist and to be about their business and their common end. So, I mean, rights language is amenable to both points of view, the dignity of the individual and the dignity of social workers.
Does Rerum Novarum speak about rights? No, it does not. I mean, I know Oswald von Neubräuning, who basically was important for Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later. And I mean, Rerum Novarum was very, very important. I know that, but the rights language was not used there.
I respectfully disagree, but what I would agree on is that it's not the kind of rights language that we all object to. It is rooted ontologically in being. On one hand, substantial being, human person, and on the other hand, the social being. That's what it's grounded in, and it's being provident for oneself and others, and being about business, a certain way of life and a pattern of life, good for yourself and good for others. And then, of course, we have to start naming them and giving examples of them and why one is rather different than the other. So my condo association in New Jersey, it is an association and it's legal, but I don't hang out at condo association meetings. I mean, it is not like being in a faculty. And it's not like being the head of a family. You know, this just requires, adequate descriptions. But it is legal. You better believe it's legal. And it has social consequences.
Thank you all very much for attending. Let's do our last remaining task, which is to thank you very much, Professor Hittinger, for spending this time with us. Again, if any students would like a copy of this book, we do have a first come, first served sign-up sheet right here.
Yeah.